With Terry Southwest T Flenory free from jail and 50 Cent's television series supposedly getting ready to go into production, going to be doing a series of little stories about not so much the criminal activities of BMF, which are already well documented, but interesting things about their impact on the cultural landscape from the early 2000s all the way up until now. Did you know that Kim Kardashian is tied in with the story of the BMF indictment? If you didn't know, you're about to find out. July 2005, Southwest T Flenory and his right-hand man Slim board a private plane in Los Angeles. They have $5 million in jewelry. They fly to St. Louis, and their trip's purpose is to loan the jewelry to Young Jeezy for a music video shoot. They get to St. Louis. For some reason, the video has been canceled, so they're sitting in the loo with $5 million in jewelry, and T makes some calls, and they decide, since they're on that side of the country, they're in the Midwest, they're gonna drive to Cleveland and meet some people and do some gambling. And so they pull out of St. Louis, and they cross the bridge through East St. Louis, and then they're in Illinois, and they get flicked by the state troopers. So Southwest T and Slim are in the car. Troopers come up. They give them some ID. It doesn't say their proper names. And the trooper does a quick search of the car, and he finds 21 cell phones and all this jewelry. So they get taken down to the trooper outpost, and they're questioning T and Slim. And eventually T admits that, well, these IDs that he has with whatever name, they're not real. And he says the only reason he carries fake ID is because he doesn't want law enforcement to know that his brother is Demetrius Big Meech Flenory, who's, at this point, he's put the billboard up in Atlanta, and he's drawn a lot of attention to himself. The quarrel between the two brothers has been well documented from wiretaps and different sources. T was upset that Meech was drawing attention, by being in the rap world, and Meech's contention was that, so what? He wasn't committing any crimes in public, whereas T was on a lot of wiretaps saying incriminating things, which ended up being true. So T says, hey, I manage people in the music industry, and one of them is Damon Thomas. And Damon Thomas was a big-time producer. Now, Damon Thomas was a Grammy-nominated music producer. He had a pop production group called The Underdogs with another guy. They worked with everyone from Chris Brown to R. Kelly to Pink, Lionel Richie. He was going to go in and do Whitney Houston's comeback album, and he was married to Kim Kardashian from 2000 to 2003. Now, Kim Kardashian, years later on the Kardashian show, said she married Damon Thomas while she was, quote, high on ecstasy. And that was also her excuse for her sex tape with Ray J. You're high on ecstasy for a couple hours. Getting married is a little more elaborate process than that, but whatever. So anyways, T Flenory says that this jewelry belongs to Damon Thomas, former husband at this point, because they got divorced in 2003, of Kim Kardashian, who's moved on from him to having sex tapes with Ray J and trying to climb up the food chain of fame, which we see she's done very well. And her little sister Kylie is now the first self-made female billionaire, wink, wink. And so there's no drugs or guns or anything in the car. Flenory and Slim get released. But he wants, it's $5 million worth of jewelry, and the police keep that, and he wants to get it back. He said it's owned by Damon Thomas, and Damon Thomas is contacted, and he tells law enforcement he borrowed it from Jacob the jeweler. Now, if you're not old enough to remember, rappers used to rap about Jacob the jeweler. R. Kelly, wrist frozen thanks to Jacob the jeweler. A sign of having made it in pop culture was to have one of Jacob's special watches. Jacob the jeweler had opened his Kaplan Jewelry Exchange in Manhattan's Diamond District when he was just 21, and by the early 2000s he was just as much a part of hip-hop culture as someone like Puffy or Nelly or any of the rappers. He was supplying everybody with jewelry. They were rapping about him. And even though his Jacob and Company didn't do the numbers of, say, something like Harry Winston, he was bringing in $20 million a year in gross receipts. And in terms of design, he was, one of the most influential jewelers, certainly in America at the time. For rappers, it meant that you had made it to the top if you copped a quote-unquote Jacob, one of his giant diamond-encrusted 5 time zone watches, which cost anywhere from $5,000 to $1 million. All sorts of celebrities had one, from Leonardo DiCaprio to rock singer Bono of U2 to Shaquille O'Neal, and even Elton John bought 22 watches from Jacob to give away as presents. Jacob the jeweler himself was making so much money he bought a $12.7 million townhouse in Manhattan, which he put his flagship store in. You can see it was a really nice place. And for his 40th birthday party, which was held at a Midtown restaurant called Cipriani's, Jacob spent over $1 million, according to the New York Times. 400 guests, including his friend Puff Daddy, Praz of the Fugees, which was huge at the time. Boyz II Men showed up. So Jacob was really at the center of hip-hop culture, and this is who Terry Flenory was getting his jewelry from. So Damon Thomas, Kim Kardashian's husband, is in the middle of this swirling investigation against BMF at this point. Now, Damon Thomas was on paper as being a big customer of Jacob's, but apparently he wasn't paying in a timely fashion. In 2006, Jacob filed a $1.9 million lawsuit against Thomas, charging that between 2004 and 2005, which was the BMF time, this was right at the time when Terry got pulled over, that Thomas didn't pay him for about $950,000 worth of jewelry. It alleged specifically that on June 21st, 2005, Thomas borrowed various pieces of jewelry worth $965,000 and was either unwilling or unable to return them. When Thomas was informed of Jacob's suit by the New York Post, the paper said he sounded flabbergasted. "This isn't right," he said, contending that Jacob Arabo was blaming Thomas for a dispute with an unidentified third person. Perhaps that was Terry Flenory. Later on the same day, Jacob dropped the lawsuit. Now let's go back to T and Slim being pulled over in Illinois back in 2005. Once they were let go, Terry got Damon Thomas on the phone and orchestrated a plan to get his jewelry back. So Flenory asked Damon Thomas to be what's called a nominee. He requested Thomas come to New York in order to meet with Jacob the jeweler and make a claim that the jewelry seized from T. Flenory at the time of his arrest, in fact, belonged to Damon Thomas. Why would he do that? Well, Damon Thomas, at this point, I don't know if he had won Grammys or he was nominated for Grammys. He had produced a lot of big songs. He had a legitimate income stream that could possibly account for buying stuff from Jacob, and certainly his position in the music industry makes it a legitimate story to say, hey, I borrowed all this jewelry and we were letting a rapper use it, as opposed to T. Flenory, who has no visible means to own that kind of jewelry. And circumstantial evidence like that can be used against you to build, if nothing else, an income tax case. But even in a drug conspiracy, when they're showing how much money you have, and I think back to interviewing a Detroit federal prosecutor about a Detroit mafia case he did in the 70s, where one of the things they did to Tony Giacalone, a Detroit mob boss, was they zoomed in on, I think, a pinky ring he had, and they had a jeweler get on the stand and say, well, that's worth, $80,000, and this is back in the 70s. And then the federal government was able to say, well, Mr. Giacalone, on your taxes, you claim whatever fake job he had, plumbing supplies or something. You make $30,000 a year, how do you own an $80,000 watch? And that's part of the circumstantial evidence they can use in proving that you're running a big drug conspiracy. So T. Flenory, if he wanted his jewelry back, couldn't say it was his. And so Damon Thomas and Jacob the jeweler concocted a plan, and Jacob started filling out false paperwork. Damon Thomas eventually stated that he came to New York along with T. Flenory, and they met with Jacob Araboff in order to fill out paperwork so that Thomas could make a claim that the jewelry seized from Flenory had belonged to him. On May 11th, 2006, Damon Thomas testified before a Detroit grand jury as to his association with Terry Flenory. Now, Jacob Araboff's lawyer, Ben Brafman, very, very high profile, said this: "I think desperate people do desperate things when they get in trouble to get out of trouble," implying that Damon Thomas was lying. But of course, there was a paper trail against Araboff, and eventually he pled guilty to lesser charges. So when the DEA showed up at Jacob's office to talk about the jewelry that Terry wanted back, he had already pulled Damon Thomas's file out because he was prepared. He had just met with Flenory and Thomas. So it seemed like Araboff was a pretty willing participant in all this. I doubt if he was intimidated into anything. In fact, probably, maybe that's why he got so popular in certain circles, was his willingness to take cash and fudge paperwork. And perhaps that's why the feds came down on him. They knew he had been doing this. This wasn't a one-time thing, because he let Flenory and Damon Thomas fly into town and did the paperwork. And remember, you know, if you think gangsters or crime or drugs are bad, the real way to stop it is simply enforcing the money laundering laws. So you look at a bank like HBC, which a couple years ago admitted to laundering billions of dollars for the Sinaloa cartel, and they got slapped with a couple $100 million fine, no criminal charges for anybody. Well, if you don't let the banks, if you don't let the Jacob the jewelers of the world take the dirty money, no one's going to want to bother making more than, you know, I don't know, a couple $100,000. So without people like Jacob the jeweler, you can't have big drug dealers, and, you know, you won't. Without people like Jacob the jeweler, you really can't have gangsters. So if you think gangsters and big drug dealers are bad, then you need to look at the kind of people that take their money. That's for you to decide. Is BMF any worse than McDonald's? Not for me. Is BMF any worse than McDonald's? I think we each have to decide that on our own. But certainly, if McDonald's couldn't deposit money in the bank, there'd be a lot less fat people in the country. We do know that. So after a couple years, Jacob the jeweler in 2008, he had been swooped up in a money laundering indictment, and his lawyer worked out a deal. And in 2008, he pled guilty. He got sentenced. He ended up doing under 2 years in federal prison. And the federal government said, quote, "Araboff was an active participant in a money laundering scheme hatched by the members of Detroit's black mafia family." According to prosecutors, testimony about Araboff's dealing with BMF came from 6 different sources, including 4 men who ended up pleading guilty to drug and money laundering charges in the case. Damon Thomas ended up being the key witness. It's interesting, in between the BMF indictments and Araboff going to prison, Damon Thomas actually did a bunch of production work on the Dreamgirls soundtrack. So he was still working while he was working. But of course, that's true for most guys. They keep working while they're working. According to the government, Damon Thomas initially balked at testifying, but eventually made incriminating statements under pressure. He testified that at Araboff's personal home, he agreed to sign a fraudulent document prepared by Araboff himself. And he testified that other documents prepared by Araboff and presented to federal drug agents were, quote, misleading or completely false. As a little side note, Jacob the jeweler's wife didn't like the BMF guys coming to their personal house where Jacob the jeweler had him coming, so he started having to meet Terry Flenory in hotel rooms all around New York, according to BMF member Eric Bivens, who was one of the guys who flipped. Mark Whaley, another guy who flipped, told investigators he met with Araboff in a separate meeting, I guess, for some jewelry, and that was to launder about $300,000, which is what buying jewelry that the jeweler doesn't register is. It's money laundering. So Araboff was doing this with a lot of guys that were part of the BMF conspiracy, so he knew what was going on. And Arnold A.R. Boyd, one of the biggest informants in the case, gave statements that Terry had a standing $1 million line of credit with Araboff. He testified that on the eve of the Flenory brothers being indicted and sent to prison, he was with Terry when he gave Araboff hundreds of thousands of dollars on multiple separate occasions. Whaley testified that Araboff told him the government was on his back and that he couldn't take such large amounts of cash anymore. So Araboff was continuing to work with BMF even though he knew he was being investigated. And who knows what other cases Jacob the jeweler gave information on. We just know about BMF because it's high profile. And, you know, they didn't have the reputation of being like ruthless murderers. I mean, maybe Jacob gave info on a lot of guys that were known to practice violence very frequently, so that federal prosecutors kept his name out of their paperwork. Jacob the jeweler eventually pled guilty to reduced charges and served under 2 years in federal prison starting in 2008. Damon Thomas received no jail time, and his former wife, Kim Kardashian, has gone on to be one of the biggest pop stars of this century so far. Al Prophet, BMF, American Dope.